All right, welcome everyone to tonight's panel. Tonight we have Rebecca Adams and Julia Robinson Moore, and the panel will be moderated by Lindsay Paris Lopez. Thanks for moderating, Lindsay. So we're going to get started in just a second. Starting now, please start dropping your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. You can just click that open and start dropping your questions. And if you see questions that have been asked in there that you would like to see, that you would most like to see addressed tonight, give them a little thumbs up to upvote them. And the ones that get the most upvotes bump up to the top. So they're the ones that we're most likely to see. So anyways, really excited for this panel. And Lindsay, I now turn the time over to you.
Thank you, Joe, and thank you so much to Julia Robinson Moore and Rebecca Adams. I know that we have all so thoroughly enjoyed your keynote and your workshop. They've just been absolutely wonderful. Rebecca, your workshop on loving mimesis just really inspired me to see more deeply into the creative and generative power of positive mimesis. And it gave me new insight as to how we can become co-creators with God through loving relationship. And Julia, your keynote was absolutely fabulous, and it helped us to understand how to apply loving mimesis to racial reconciliation and really all. So thank you both so much, and it's so good to be here with you and to be here among friends. So my questions may draw on the work of I'm really excited to. I'm sorry.
That's what you said.
Yeah, I'm really just so excited to hear how you can both answer the questions together in loving dialogue, because I think that will give us all an example of loving mimesis in action. So thank you so much. My first question is, how and why do you think so many Christians got Jesus's message so horribly wrong? Yeah, that's my first question. Just a very general question.
Your audio is cutting out.
Oh,
yeah, but I understood the question. Rebecca, did you?
Oh, I couldn't hear it.
Okay.
I'll repeat it. I'm sorry. I'll repeat it, and I'll talk more clearly. Hopefully, my audio will work. And the question is simply, how do you think Christians got Jesus's message so wrong? Took it in such a sacrificial and racist direction?
In case you didn't hear that, because you did, okay.
Yeah.
All right. Do you want to go first, or?
No, I was going to ask you to go first.
Okay. All right.
Right directly to your paper.
Yeah. So one of the things that I point out, and I've actually discovered in even further research, is that instead of Christianity sort of shaping culture, culture actually shaped Christianity. So if you look at the founding of America, while many people came to this country for religious freedom, they also came for economic gain. And those who were so bent on economic gain, whether through the institution of slavery or agriculture or politics, those kinds of ideals begin to infiltrate Christianity. And so Christianity became sort of corrupted in many ways by the American culture, and avarice and mammonism became part of that structure. And so sometimes I make an argument that there are actually two Christianities operating in America. You certainly have the doctrinal Christianity that's written in the books, and you do have church structure, but you also have a Christianity that's been sort of malleable in terms of its support for political corruption. And if I can even go back to the institution of slavery, Christianity was actually used to justify the institution of slavery, the dehumanization of Black, brown, and yellow peoples. And there's so much evidence of the ways in which the culture of economic gain, avarice, mammon was infiltrated Christian doctrine and Christian theology. So you might have a sermon that says Jesus died for your sins, but you had a culture in the pews that said, well, Jesus died for everybody's sin, but other people are more sinful than other people. And in the case of America, it has historically been the bent of the church to say that white people are more righteous than non-white people. And so you have that kind of history. I can speak more on that, but I'm gonna turn it over.
Yeah, I was thinking about this question, and I'm very interested in how I've been working on theological ideas and how they shape people. And I think the problem goes back even beyond American culture, just to sacrificial Christianity in general, that you've always had sacrificial Christianity, and before that you had sacrificial Judaism. You know, you've always had sacrificial religion competing with the new insight about nonviolence. So I do agree with you about how the culture has tended to shape Christians instead of the other way around. Not always, but sometimes. Yeah. And when you have a sacrificial Christianity, I think the form that it took in America was racialized. So, but the problem goes back to, I think there's the economic motivations and things like that are going on too. But I also think within Christianity, within the doctrines themselves, I do think that the sacrificial doctrines, certain theological ideas, did shape people into persecutors. Those people were, there's a certain theology that is a theology of the persecutor. And what's interesting about it is that even people who are in dominance over other people may be doing that because they're identifying with a powerful God. They're identifying with a powerful God that actually within their theology makes them victims. Mm-hmm. So the penal substitution theory, for instance, of the atonement, it turns people into victims of God. And so then what they do is they identify with the abuser and they lord it over other people. So people can be both perpetrators and victims at the same time. And so I'm not saying that there isn't a very distinctive set of practices that happened where white Christians really did oppress people of color. I'm not saying that everybody's the same or anything like that, but I think that so I do think you can make a distinction between perpetrators and victims, but I think that those categories themselves are an insidious result of sacrificial forms of thinking.
Mm-hmm. Thank you both. Those were definitely very complex answers, and they've definitely led to more thought. They've definitely provoked me to more thought, and I'm sure everyone here. There's a question already that goes along with the question I just asked. So it's from Reverend Jackie, and I'll just go ahead and read it. She says she appreciates the observation by Julia on culture shaping Christianity. How would you see or recap a vision of Christianity shaping culture? in a way that is not theocratic leaning?
Not theocratic. Don't know whether I could totally make that argument. Not theocratic. You know, forgive me, Reverend Jackie. I'm just going to speak from my perspective on that, and I might not answer your question. But I think to Rebecca Adams' point about loving mimesis, and that the imitation of Christ is so central. You know, God is a God of love. And so what Christianity would look like if individuals and communities and churches had the true idea of God, that God is a loving person. And as, Rebecca has totally presented in her workshop, that God is the desires, the goodness of those that imitate him. I think had that story been lifted up, then we wouldn't have the corruptions of Christianity that we have now. And I think that a Christianity today that would be transformed would be a transformed Christianity that, number one, centers on the love of God and Jesus Christ for humanity and focuses on the loving nature of the Father. Two, for so long and so many centuries, we've had a God that was viewed as always seeking vengeance or out to get people. I just remember Cotton Mather's and other ministers about sinners in the hands of an angry God. And so the angry God is what has sort of driven America's cultural consciousness around Christianity and about God. I mean, you even think about insurance policies. When you call the insurance, if a tree falls on your car, it's an act of God. Well, God is not in the business of doing violence against his creation. And so I think a Christianity that, number one, centers itself around the loving nature of God and Jesus Christ, and number two, repeats that God is a God of love and he wants the best, and he's not about violence, and he's not about bringing violence toward people. I think that would be a transformative view of Christianity. So forgive me if I didn't totally answer your question in the proper way, but that's my best stab at it.
So do you want me to say anything about that?
Definitely, if you have, yeah, absolutely.
Brief. I mean, I think that it might be difficult to institutionalize that sort of loving movement. I don't think it's ever going to be at the top of the political power. I think it's going to work alongside as a prophetic voice. So I think when you had the civil rights movement, for instance, it was Christian, although there were people who participated in it who did not identify as Christian. Everyone could agree upon and participate in the nonviolent the nonviolent methods that they were using, and that were based in love and they were based upon a love ethic of Martin Luther King. And he articulated them as Christian, but they were, of course, not exclusively. They were able to be used by other people. So I think you can have a powerful movement, but it may not look institutionalized.
Yeah, I think that's so good, because there you have the prime example of a grassroots movement, and you have people of like mind. They might not have necessarily been of like faith or like religious tradition, but they had a like mind about the humanization of people and the value of life and human life. And I think that any movement from this point on that's going to be transformative is going to present a platform where people can value each other's humanity and value human life and just value peace, right? Not value nonviolence. And so I think that that's a powerful transformation, and that might be the non-theocratic aspect of it, that everyone of whatever religious tradition, everyone likes peace, everyone wants the value of human life, you know, recognized. And I think that's a transcendent kind of thing. So
Transcendent, right?
yeah.
Absolutely. Beautiful. Thank you both. Yeah, when you speak to prophetic voices, Dr. Martin Luther King and others, it just makes me think that no matter how much Christianity has been corrupted and no matter how much damage it has done, some people have still seen the message of love through even that damage, and it always amazes me to think that the message can still come through, especially when when people were introduced to this message in chains. How did Black people find the liberating message of Jesus despite, even still in slavery? How did that message come through? How did people see the love of Jesus even when white Christianity tried so hard to reincarnate him in a white body and use him as a weapon?
Yeah, that's such a great question. So let me just take you back for a little bit. So I went to Ghana, and I did visit, I think I referenced this in my talk, I did visit many of the slave dungeons there. And what just struck me, when you first walk into, for example, the slave castle in Elmina, there's a church right in the middle of it. And I just thought, oh my gosh, you've already been captured. And then the first introduction to the religion of the oppressor really is Christianity. And then you get on the slave boat, and then you have all the atrocities that happen in the context of people saying that I'm self-identifying as a Christian. And then you get to the plantation, and then you have something called, what I term, and some scholars will allude to, as plantation Christianity, which is a Christianity that was espoused by the slave masters in order to make slaves more docile. So you had slave catechisms that basically said, what did God make you for? Well, you made me to serve my earthly master as unto my heavenly Father. So you have what I call a compound of oppressive conditions that Christianity was presented to people of African descent, who, by the way, some of them actually came with Christianity, because Christianity was in Africa way before the slave trade actually began. So let's keep that in mind. But you also have people of Muslim beliefs and who are Muslim. And you also had people who are studying just a variety of African traditional religions. So when Christianity actually becomes part of people of African descent's religion, it comes in this compounded context of oppression and degradation, but it also comes in confrontation to some of their African traditional worldviews and their religions. And we find that there are two Christianities running alongside, yet again, in America. And you have the Christianity that comes from the plantation master's household and from white elites in the colonial and antebellum period. And you also have the Christianity that's done in secret. And that secret Christianity was practiced by slaves outside the gaze of their slave masters. You can read the book Albert J. Ravito's Slave Religion. There's so many other books that talks about the way slaves would hide themselves in glades and whisper the scriptures that they could remember, or they would have the kettles that they used to boil the water or do their laundry or the master's laundry in. They would turn those kettles upside down and whisper, because if you were caught whispering anything about Jesus outside the eyes of the slave master, you would totally be whipped or sometime even sold away. But it is in those secret moments that you have what I call, and what has been documented by the WP narratives, which was done by Carnegie Woodson, which were all these slave narratives. You could just put WP narratives in Google and you could find them, where slaves were actually having an encounter with the divine presence of Jesus Christ. And so then you also have praise houses, and praise houses were houses where slaves were usually, it was the slave house that the master built, but slaves would gather in secret and they would worship God. They would have this experience, and the God that they were worshiping was built on those scriptural stories about Exodus and the freedom that was given to the Hebrew children, and also the emphasis of Jesus as a suffering servant, Jesus who was in partnership in their suffering and who was lovingly looking to God. And so those images of God freeing people from bondage and of Jesus being the suffering servant became really the primary ways and the stories that African Americans gravitated to. And they began actually to convert Christianity unto their own experience. And I think that's such a powerful agency that can be recognized. And it also shows that God is totally out the box, because even if you have narratives in a culture that's going to corrupt the true messages of the gospel of Jesus Christ, you have God intervene in ways that we didn't even think of in order to get the true heart. So the first thing I usually ask my students is, why would Black folks ever want to be a Christian anyway? Their oppressors, came in slave ships with Christianity. And the answer has always been, people met the true God of Christianity, that loving Father, that loving figure, Jesus Christ, and they had a divine direct experience. And so we see that in the writings of Sojourner Truth, and we see that in other slave narratives if you decide to look at it. Sojourner Truth is a good one to read. So, and Harriet Tubman, right? She had these wonderful experiences.
Harriet Jacobs. I used to teach that book.
Oh yeah, Harriet Jacobs.
I taught literature, and I taught freshman literature, and I taught that book several times, The Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl.
Mm-hmm.
She has one chapter in that book where she just gives this brilliant and devastating critique of slaveholding Christianity, and what it believes theologically, how it teaches people, and then what the people of color, Black people, believe themselves. And it's devastating because they can see right through all of that stuff.
That's right.
And they go to the passages that are the most relevant to their experience, and they just wrest it away completely from the discourse of the slaveholders. So they know that stuff is fake.
Yeah.
Thank you. That I have a lot to read. I know, and it is something to remember because Julia, in your talk, you did mention the slave ships and the how Christianity was preached on the ships and before they even got on the ships. But it's so important to remember that wasn't the beginning of Christianity in Africa. That was just the introduction to a hypocritical, anti-Christian European form. And so that's incredibly important to remember. Thank you for that. I have more of my own questions, but we have a chat room filled with questions that seem to be evolving from this discussion already. So the next one is from Preston, and he writes, Julia, renegade Baptist preacher and civil rights once asked to speak about race relations at New York's prestigious Riverside Church. And he said, the question you are really asking is, what can we do about racism and keep all this? And the answer, my brothers and sisters, is nothing. It's one thing for white Christians to read the new Jim Crow or invite a few Black people to their worship service. But what, in your opinion, will white churches and Christians have to let go of or give up in order to be delivered from the Christianity that has enabled racism and embraced the good gospel of Jesus that you describe?
All right, Preston, you come out swinging. This is an excellent question. I actually will refer back to Bishop Desmond Tutu and his daughter's fourfold path. And, you know, the first step in that fourfold path is actually telling the story. And for some churches, it's been 150 years. For other churches who were founded in the 1700s, it's been 300 years. But that story of the church's complicity in the institution of slavery and the oppression of non-white peoples has never been told. And so you have many Christians who are very proud of their heritage, and well, they should be, but they do not want to talk about the ways in which some of their ancestors enslaved and dehumanized, as well as disenfranchised many people of color. So when churches first begin, and listen, it's important to tell that story, especially for the body of Christ. It's important to tell that story from their identity as Christians, because it's, you know, that's a hard story to come to grips with. And unless you have the capacity of a loving father right beside you that says, I'm going to love you and walk with you through this journey, then it's going to be a little bit harder than expected. But I guess the first thing is for churches to actually tell a story. And some churches say, well, you know, we looked at our family history and our church history and we didn't own any slaves. Yes, but there was a transfer of wealth that made you part of a privileged community that was able to still benefit from the slave owner that may have been around in your vicinity. And so every church, I think, needs to come to grips with that. The second thing is to name the hurt, right? To name the legacies of that slavery, to name the legacies of white privilege and of those who maybe didn't agree with segregation, but certainly didn't do anything to mitigate it in any way. Name those kind of hurt, and then look at the legacies of that. And then the last one is to operate in, the last two is to operate in forgiveness. For maybe for some of you, you might do your genealogy and you might actually have slave owners in your past, to forgive the complicity of your communities and your ancestors or your great-grandfather's role in the institution of slavery or in the segregationist culture that arose in America. And then finally, to usually renew, right? Renew those relationships. Well, for many white churches, especially who have slaves that descended out of their pews and created their own churches, there's the occasional Sunday morning preacher swap, or maybe, you know, we'll come to hear a concert, but there's never true any kind of relationship built. And so, you know, I guess I'm challenging, based on Preston's question, which is such an excellent one, I'm challenging the body of Christ to begin to build relationships with non-white communities. Too much of Christianity has been experienced and espoused in a vacuum that has ignored the story of race prejudice, historical disenfranchisement, and a plethora of other isms. And when the church actually begins to name the story, confess the sin, forgive themselves, and then believe Jesus to bridge the gap between those communities that their ancestors unfairly treated, that's the beginning of making some really solid steps. So it's more than just points on the calendar. It's about active steps of building relationship across racial lines within the same faith and in the same denomination. So that's a long answer. I'm a long answer person. So, all right.
What I hear is so powerful about what you're saying, Julia, is the storytelling and forgiveness is so liberating, because nobody is clean. Like,
That's
you
right.
don't have to be afraid of what you're going to find. People find out there are, you know, you watch Finding Your Roots on PBS, and people find out there were slave owners in their backgrounds, and it doesn't matter that it's not like that chains you forever. It's more like you just bring out whatever the truth is, and then you come to terms with it and you are able to forgive it. And it doesn't matter what the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa stressed, that people need to hear the truth. They don't necessarily need retribution. They don't even need people necessarily to pay, but they need to hear the truth. And so knowing that anything can be forgiven if it comes out in the open is very different from the fear that you're going to be targeted. We have to be careful that we don't target people who admit to things, that we give some kind of space for people to have been wrong and to make mistakes and to come to terms with things.
Yeah. I think it's also, I mean, this is such a great segue for your arguments, Rebecca, about what loving mimesis looks like, right? What does the imitation of Christ look like when you desire the value of the person, even though that person is different? And I think that this fourfold pathway and the implementation of it is so reflective of what you have just laid out in terms of what is a creative, generative, positive, life-giving mimesis that can happen in churches, you know.
Wonderful. Thank you both for that beautiful discussion. I'm a little sorry that I can't think faster on my feet. It's just so much information just washing into my brain, and maybe juggling the contents of my brain around a little bit in the flood. But I think it's so important that as Christians we talk about our complicity in the murder of Jesus. I mean, we talk about, we confess our sins, and we always go and say that, Jesus died for our sins, and we talk about our complicity in Jesus's death, but it's hard to extend that for many people to the complicity in the death of real live people, even in the name of Christianity. And a lot of people in the chat room have made similar comments to that, and there are some, and I'm losing my place with which one to ask next. So let's see. Well, there's a question here from Daniel along the lines of what I just said. He says, as we see Jesus forgiving before he dies, and that God forgives before Jesus comes among us, we might then suggest that Jesus died because of our sin, not to forgive it. Having said, Pastor, I more often choke on the words of institution, that he gives us his body and blood for the forgiveness of sin. Remembering his death as a self-sacrifice, yes. But I have begun asking myself, why do we even practice Eucharist, especially as Jesus is lynched, much like or for similar reasons, of so many Black Americans? What are your thoughts on practicing Eucharist in light of Girardian scapegoatism? And does Eucharist then twist the connection? He doesn't say this, but I wonder if it refers to our understanding of Eucharist, then twist the connection of the lynching of Jesus as redemptive, then destroy the connection of Jesus with the lynching of Black folks. So the question seems to me to be asking, does the Eucharist, does the Eucharist and maybe the language we use around it seem to find a redemptive power in the lynching and itself? That's how I'm trying to interpret the question. Does that do a disservice to the church and the message of Jesus and and the actions of the church.
Julia, I would think you could speak to that the best, but there are sacrificial ways of interpreting the Eucharist and non-sacrificial ways of interpreting the Eucharist, and they could be very different from each other. So the issue isn't so much practicing the Eucharist as what do we mean by it? And behind that is our theology, like I was saying before. What do we have, a non-sacrificial theology? Do we have a life-giving theology? Do we have a theology of participation in the life of Jesus, in the life of God that was made possible for us by Jesus? Or do we have a sacrificial interpretation of Jesus' death that then we think we're commemorating in the Eucharist? Anyway, I said something. I intended to give it to you, Julia, but
No, I think that's wonderful. I really needed that because I needed time to think. And I totally, I guess I want to come at this question through the work of James Cone, where he talks about the cross and the lynching tree. And I want to point the listeners back, if they were able to watch the PowerPoint presentation that was released today. You know, there's a huge picture of Jesus Saves in this church, and they're all Klan members in the church. And I think that the Eucharist, or the communion for Protestants, is totally, can be totally seen for me separate from the ways in which the culture has infiltrated the understanding of what Jesus is. And let me speak to that in detail. So the Ku Klux Klan, whenever they burn a cross, they understand that cross being the light of Christ. That's the language that they use. Whenever they decide to lynch a Jewish person, a Hispanic, or an African American person, they believe that that's an act of worship, that's ridding the world of evil. And so you have people so concentrate on the act of sacrifice, or the act of crucifixion, that they totally distort what's happening in the scriptures. And so I think the reason why James Cone can write a book about, I'm seeing this connection between the cross and the lynching of Black bodies, is because you have, again, this infiltration of culture, and specifically white privilege and white supremacy, that begins to become the lens by which traditional understandings of Christian doctrine are seen. In fact, in many ways, especially if I just look at the Klan, which is the most extreme version, you cannot separate whiteness from Christianity. And we can go back to Virginia laws. If you just, for those history people here, you can go to the mid to late 1600s, and you can look at the ways in which whiteness became synonymous with Christianity, and non-whiteness became synonymous with heathenism. And so, you know, the scriptures hadn't changed. What changed is that the culture began to create narratives that distort it, and they use Christian language to sort of justify those pejorative narratives. So I again, building on what Rebecca said, it's based on how you understand your theology, but the link between what James Cone is arguing is that whiteness, white privilege, white supremacy began to be entrenched around cultures that believed that violence was a way to bring peace to their society. And for white supremacy, violence against non-Black bodies, or non-white bodies, was a way to do that. So I don't know whether I answered all of the things, but the question just got me just thinking about the links of that.
Are you saying that those acts, those heinous acts, sort of became sacraments of this distorted form of Christianity?
Yeah, absolutely. And if you think about the way that the Klan works, they usually, you know, many of them light crosses, but most of them light crosses for two purposes. They want to represent the light of Christ, in their words, but they also want to terrorize those people who do not fit in their understanding of who is a valuable human being. And so you have that become part of the ritual of worship, the ritual of recognizing that the light of Christ. So, so for me, racism in that context has all the elements of religion. It has a story, it has a ritual, and it has a community that is that has an identity that is reinforced by the repetition of those rituals of cross burning and terrorization of non-white bodies. And it certainly has the story of why white people are very righteous and why non-white people are very evil. And we see these narratives play over and over again in different aspects. So.
Racism itself functioning as a religion in itself with all of the, this is our group, what binds us together over and against others. I mean, that's something Girardians can understand, and yet it's just devastating, and it's so anti-Jesus, which that's what we have to contend with. That's what we have to grapple with.
It seems important to make for white people to make the distinction between a kind of active racism like that and a kind of passive racism where you're participating in a racist system without understanding you're doing that. I think that in discussions of white privilege, sometimes that's papered over. And I think white people feel, you know, you could just say, oh, it's white fragility, but there's a genuine sense that white people sometimes have that their experience, they feel confused, like, well, I don't feel like I'm a racist. Well, there's a difference between participating passively in racist systems and being an overt active racist. And I'm not sure that distinction is clearly made, but with passive racism, you know, Jesus says from the cross, forgive them for they know not what they are doing. So, you know, there's a way in which many people participate in racism where they themselves are, I don't know if you should call them perpetrators. We're all enmeshed in these systems of violence. And so to simply say all white people are perpetrators seems to me to lack nuance. Instead, I would say we're all enslaved. We're all in systems of violence. Now, some people actively take that on and become perpetrators, and other people just are not aware of their complicity. But it can be forgiven if it's passive. I think that's a different group of people. That's a different experience than the active kind of twisted types of Christianity that you're describing, Julia, where it's almost anti-sacramental. It's evil. It's an evil form of Christianity.
Yeah, I'm so glad you said that because passive racism, when white allies become awakened to the ways in which they were born into a system that, you know, privileges one group over another, and they seek to educate themselves or try to find ways to mitigate or use, or for another way is I've seen many white allies try to use the privilege that they have in order to ally with non-whites in order to make, you know, more equal avenues of equality. I think that's so important. I also think that process of being aware that you've been a participant in passive racism is also very hard, and people get stuck in the guilt or the shame of it. And I think for those within the body of Christ, Christ frees us from that, from being stuck in those places because of his
productive.
Absolutely. It would be impossible without knowing that we are forgiven by the love of God, and especially as it's modeled in Christ. I think it was Beverly Tatum who said that that racism is kind of like one of those moving tracks at the airport, and it's just you can't really escape it. You can walk backwards, but it takes effort. But if you just stand there, you will go with the flow of it. And I think that leads into matters of accountability. And we have a question about that. So Suella wants to talk about the distinctions between she wants to talk about the intersections between loving mimesis, justice, and accountability.
That's a good question.
Can you repeat that a little bit? I'm not quite sure. Was it in the form of a question?
Yes, it is a question, and it's just, can you talk about, and then can you talk about the distinctions between loving mimesis, justice, and accountability? Either their distinctions or their intersections, or both.
Julia, do you want to speak to that?
I can start, and I have notes from your wonderful lecture here, and I had some stars by some of the things you said, and one of them was the model. The model mediator has the desire for the potential good and welfare of the imitator. And if, I'll just use America, if America wants a more equitable society, if they want to see the God kind of justice that wants everyone's mutuality, wants everyone to be equally treated, then society is going to look at those they have deemed other and begin to want the best for them. Not because they feel compelled because the laws of the land say so, but because they genuinely desire the good and the welfare of the other, because they are invested in a more equitable and mutual society. So I think that's what a loving mimesis does, because, you know, as you pointed out, Rebecca, when God begins to interact with us, he's not trying to get our subjectivity to dominate or to rule or to take from us. He loves the individuality and the difference or the otherness that we bring, and he wants the best for us. He wants the good for us. Well, what if we imitated that in our justice system? What if we imitated that in the ways we treat our neighbor? I think there's so much good in American justice systems, but there's also a way in which the American justice system wants a kind of justice that is for retribution or for vengeance. Well, what if we had a justice system that says, well, we want to give an accountability, so there isn't a cause and effect that you have to deal with, but we're not bent for the sole purpose of punishing, but we're bent for the sole purpose of rehabilitating for the better good of the entire society, and that we're going to recognize your humanity. Even if you're a cold-blooded murderer, we're still going to recognize that you're created in the image of God. We're going to call you into accountability, but we're still going to look for ways to bring you back to the full human that you should be. I think that's part of the process. And I don't think, I think the justice system needs lots of prayer for that kind of perspective to hold a higher ground than just the vengeful, retributive punishment that our system operates on right now.
Yeah, unfortunately, we have one word which is being used two ways. And retributive justice is nothing like restorative justice.
That's right.
They just don't have anything to do with each other. They're not the same worldview. And so often when you hear people criticize woke culture and the idea of social justice, I think they have in mind that you're going to have people swoop down on you and condemn you for all the things you did, the perpetrators. In other words, they have a retributive framework they're thinking in, and they're just thinking it's retribution for that Black people, people of color are just seeking revenge of some kind, when they're not asking for revenge at all. They're asking for restorative justice, which is the restoring of the relationship between all the parties involved. Well,
Yeah.
how can you argue with that? I mean, that's never violent, right? It might be very difficult, but it's not violent. It's not even violent to the perpetrators, because it desires everybody's subjectivity at the same time, including the perpetrator and the victim. So justice is not incompatible with loving mimesis at all. It's just that retributive justice would not work, because you're relying upon violence and you're shutting things down. But justice as restorative is actually just what loving mimesis looks like in a legal framework.
Mhm.
And it's desiring the subjectivity of self and other at the same time. Like, if it works for one party, if it works for the victim, but it doesn't work for the perpetrator, that's not real justice. If it works for the perpetrator, but not for the victim, that's not okay. That's not real love. That's not just for the victim. So it has to be just and loving for everybody.
Yeah, that's so good, Rebecca. That is so awesome.
That is awesome. I'm actually studying, what would Jesus say about our system of mass incarceration right now. I'm actually writing about that. And I did a little bit of research and found that many victims, not all by any means, but many victims actually want a more restorative justice system, because they recognize that not only does retribution not help them in the long run, it doesn't regain any kind of loss, but it further breaks the system that made violence happen to them in the first place. So I just wanted to say that this is your night, and I don't want to take it up with my time, but that's what that made me think of just now. So, but
It doesn't work. The other doesn't even work.
That's
right.
Really. It's not satisfying.
Yeah, we think it does. We think it's going to make us feel better, but that doesn't bring any healing in the long run.
To me, that shows that people really have some really deep inbuilt need for meaning and for love. The fact that they wouldn't be satisfied. We see violence all over, and you think, well, people must be hardwired for violence. But you can also see that we're hardwired for love.
Yeah, and community and relationship. Yeah.
Absolutely. And violence has promised us a false meaning for so long. And it is false, but a lot of getting loving mimesis going involves actually coming together in the first place. And Martha has a question about that. She says, Julia, your image of the common table of early Christianity, which was inclusive of persons' religious, economic, and social status, seems to be very challenging to recreate in the United States. Not only is the church hour the most racially segregated hour in America, but the folks at Pew Research tell us that we are segregated by denomination. At the top of the income stack are Episcopalians, with 35% making over $100,000 per year, and then 25% of the ELCA Lutherans and Methodists make that, down to American Baptists at 10%, and ending with Jehovah's Witnesses at 4%, earning $100,000 or more. How can we, as you suggested at the end of your lecture, tell stories of complicity, name the hurt and damage, grant forgiveness, and attain release of the captives When most Christian churches rigorously replicate in isolation from each other these key divisions of culture, race, and class.
That's such an excellent, thanks so much,
Martha.
That, really appreciate your question. So I want to come at it two ways. I want to give a life real-time example. So my research, I have two research projects going on, and one is looking at the descendants of slave owners and the descendants of slaves in the city, in two cities. And the COVID-19 crisis has created a virtual middle ground between churches that have historically been racially segregated. Now, while the pandemic, with all of its horrific moments, is still here and doing more atrocities as we continue to move on, the pandemic has also created these new kinds of relationships. And while and while it's a virtual kind of bridge that's been developed between predominantly white and Black congregations in certain aspects, which is very positive, there's still that whole external mediation from a Girardian perspective that the two groups are able to meet in a mutual middle ground because of like faith, and yet stay in their separate spaces. I think for churches to move from the virtual niceties that are happening to more concretized forms of relational building is to begin to tell the stories of economic inequity and begin to look for ways collaboratively between those that have benefited from the legacies of slavery in America and those that have been victimized by it, but look at ways collaboratively to equal the playing field. For some churches, they have decided to pay the mortgages of the African American church that initially descended from them. Other churches have decided for other kinds of what we call reparation kinds of motives. And some other churches have even begun talks just very briefly about what it would look like to sort of merge their churches together and to create a multicultural kind of system. So, but to do that, to walk that journey is not an easy journey, because both churches, the hurting or the offending party and the party that did the hurting, has to hear the stories, has to hear the history, has to look at the complicity of it and begin to share in relationship. But if you notice that when we try to do these sort of what I call racial bridges without telling the story and without substantive relationship, then things break down. But when you start building community and friendships, when you know each other by the first name, when you begin to spend more time with each other and you can hear the hurt and the pain and the misunderstanding and work through it, then you can actually build bridges. And so those are just some concrete examples that I've seen happen. And it's been shocking for both parties to come up with it, but those that have sort of actually engaged in this process, it's been a really rewarding thing. And so not everyone's going to buy into this, because so many people are comfortable in their Christianity and in their class and in their privileged set. But for those that are really trying to live that Matthew 19 mandate, those are the people that are going to walk with Jesus and say, hey, we're going to try this. We're going to trust God to bridge the gap as we step into the waters of telling the story, naming the hurt, operating in forgiveness, and creating new relationships. And so hope that answers your question.
Yeah. And the disparities might be, the differences and disparities might be kind of difficult to overcome. There's different cultures. At one point, I went to an Episcopal church that was in an inner city neighborhood in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and it was it was a multicultural, multi-ethnic church that had been created in the 1960s when the bishop had forcibly desegregated the diocese. And what the bishop had done was actually take away the parish of the Black people. It was really traumatic for them. They had their own parish, and he actually disbanded their parish and made them go to other parishes. And those when the Black congregation went to different parishes, many of the white congregants left those congregations. And there was one congregation where many people landed, which ended up being St. Paul's in Harrisburg, uptown Harrisburg, where some of the people left, but many of the white people did not leave. And so they formed a unique community there. We had an African rector. And so there were interesting tensions. There was more tension between the Africans and the African Americans than there was between the white congregation and the Black congregation members. It was a really interesting dynamic.
Yeah, that's a whole nother conversation.
I've been in a situation where there has been reconciliation of sorts, but there were still underlying tensions that had to be dealt with all the time. There were different cultures going on. There were kind of multiple cultures at one time.
Yeah, and that's a key point, because so many people think that, well, if we just get the race question out, then we'll all get along. But I mean, we're still individuals, we're still human beings. I think, getting the race question and talking about that history is a foundational, but then there has to be a buy-in of church groups who are used to having worship music, the progress of how long a worship service goes. Right. All of those things have to be worked out, because, I'm born Presbyterian and Baptist, so I'm either got 1 hour of worship or I got 3 hours. And so, you have people who are going to make those decisions and based on that. But that's a good
right. And it's important to recognize that there are differences within the Black community in cultures.
Oh.
There were people who were in the Episcopal Church, Black members who said, I love to come here because I don't feel like I'm being shouted at. They came out of Pentecostal backgrounds, and they had gravitated to the Black Episcopal Church because the service was different and the theology was different. So
yeah, my grandma, I call myself a Presbycostal Baptist because I love all of it. But my grandmother was straight Presbyterian, and she was like, I don't want to go to your other churches that you visit because they're just too loud. So, I mean, yeah, you're absolutely right.
I like the 3 hour. I personally like the 3 hour service. And I was one of the people who liked it when the people went on and on and on, and it tended to drag out, but I thought that was part of the charm.
Oh, I like some 3 hour services too. Unfortunately, this can't be a 3 hour service, and we only have time for about one more question. And there's so many more questions that maybe can be brought up in the post discussion, hopefully. But I'll get to this. I'll get to this one first. So JC says, love can be experienced differently by the persecutor and the persecuted. In the former case, it is experienced as correction, and for the latter as justice. How can loving mimesis be an expression of this distinction in the context of racial injustice? So,
I'm not quite sure I understand the question yet.
I think it goes along with the discussion that you were just having with Suella's question, but she's asking how can loving mimesis be an expression of the distinction between she's saying love can be experienced differently by the persecutor and the persecuted. How can loving mimesis speak to the fact that it's still love experienced in different ways, and love can reach both the persecutor and the persecuted, but maybe experienced differently because of the different contexts experienced as.
Right.
How can correction be experienced as love, and how can
It's going to be experienced differently, because if you look at my colonization scenario, you have one group that is there's not even really a binary opposition. It's really a situation of inequality between those who are used to being the mediators and having the last say about how things are done, and those who are oppressed. So they have very different subjectivity. So they're going to have different experiences of redemption. And so when you have the language of needing to let go of power, which is a very common idea in Christian theology, and you see it in Girard too, that's a theology that speaks mostly to the experience of the persecutors and those in power. And what the people that are oppressed actually need to be empowered. So they need to have, feminist theologians have pointed this out, that people who have been subjugated need to have more agency and more of a sense of power and will. So they need to be loved into existence in loving mimesis, not be told to give away their power, the way that people who have been in the persecutor position, that giving away their power may look like it makes more sense. And it does make more sense for them. They may need to release certain things, become willing to listen, and give up that unequal relationship. But there's such a difference in the two positions that they are going to experience love in different ways.
Yeah.
And the giving up, Girard does emphasize a lot, withdrawing from rivalry and so forth. So he's really talking about the persecutors, or having power and giving up inappropriate power, whereas the victims of violence need to be empowered through creative mimesis. So loving mimesis can explain both things, but it's going to look different.
Yeah,
I don't know if that answers the question.
Yeah, but and to build on that, I think, racially in America, those who've participated in what Rebecca has referred to as passive racism, and those who have been very overt with their racism, it means reassessing the ways in which they can release some of that power and enable those who have had no power and very little voice in certain things to come up and have the same kind of power and voice that they have. And so that's a process. And so, the term and the organization Black Lives Matter has evoked all sorts of things. And one of the things that I found among certain groups of people is that people say, well, if I say Black Lives Matter, then I'm saying that these other lives don't matter, or I'm saying that the Black Lives Matter is more important than other people. And Black Lives Matter is really not about that. It's about giving power and voice to a group of people who have really not had as much power and voice as white Americans. And so it kind of looks like that. And this is not to say that every person that holds up a Black Lives Matter sign is going to agree with what I'm saying, because some people who hold up those signs, they want to take all the power and they want to put white people down. So let's not get it twisted. But the true goal of the originators of the Black Lives Matter movement was to bring voice and to bring opportunities for empowerment for people who had been historically over centuries disempowered and made to be voiceless. And so I think that's what a loving mimesis does. And so for white allies who want to partner in bringing a loving mimesis to the racial inequality in our country, it means looking for creative ways to empower majority voices just as much as your voice, and to bring other methods of empowerment. And that's not to take all the power from you. It's to make everyone equal. And I think that if that message can be reinforced more than anything else, then we're on the way to making a more equitable society. So.
It's amazing how defensive people get, as if there's only so much power to go around and I'm being diminished. Whereas we wouldn't say that about, you know, focusing on cancer, breast cancer in October. That doesn't mean other kinds of cancer aren't important, or that people without cancer aren't important. It just is what we're spotlighting.
Would you say that loving mimesis would help us to recognize that our power is bound up together, so that those who think they have more power by keeping others down honestly have less real power in the good creative sense, because that power is more destructive than it is creative, and we just don't know where things will lead if we truly understand our power and our agency and our humanity as being bound up together.
Well, and it's so interesting how people with that view of power, their understanding of power seems so fragile. It seems so like it is white fragility, if you want to call it that. I'm not sure. That's a whole discussion in itself, but because people have different views on that concept in that book, but it is amazing how utterly hair-triggered defensive people can get, and without realizing that it might actually be a relief to be able to lay down those defenses and listen. What harm is it going to do to listen to Black voices and hear their stories? I mean, they're people's stories. And so, like on my Facebook page, I make a point of, whenever good stories come across my feed, I pass them on, because I think we just need to hear these stories, even if we don't know the people personally, because we're not coming in contact with them in our neighborhood. We can still come in contact with them on our Facebook feed. So just to hear Black people's voices, why wouldn't that be seen as empowering and creative and something we would welcome?
Yeah.
And not only about negative experiences either, also about Black joy.
Yeah, yeah. And I was just gonna say for Christians, I mean, that's totally representative of God's idea of the body of Christ. The body, you know, the foot can't say to the arm, I don't need you, kind of thing. And so I think that, you know, when we realize that we're all connected and that there's so much power and diversity in that connection, that, you know, we're truly reflecting what the kingdom of God should look like. So
Beautiful. Perfect. I think that is probably the perfect place to end this portion of discussion and let people continue it. So I'll hand it back to Joe now.
I say one more thing before we go. I just want to give a shout out on Rebecca Adams' idea of positive mimesis, loving mimesis, and also your argument, Rebecca, on colonization and how you've defined it. And to my fellow Girardians out there, I just encourage you, join with me to just mine the depths of this wonderful concept that she's exposed, and not just that one, but just loving mimesis, and to begin to talk about this in the context of not just race, but any other kind of inequity. I think that Rebecca Adams has just presented a treasure trove of new trajectories for Girardian research and inquiry. And so just want to put that out there.
Thank you.
Wow,
Thanks for the great response.
Thanks to all of you. In the Q&A box, John Edwards said he could listen to you go on all night, and I feel the exact same way. This panel has really just kind of filled my cup, and so many great takeaways and so much more discussion to be had. And I just want to say thank you, both of you, for contributing, and Lindsay, thank you for moderating.
Thank you, Lindsay.
Thank you to everyone who asked fabulous questions, including all the ones that I was unable to get to, because this discussion inspired so much thought and so much more discussion, and I couldn't get to all the questions, but I hope you keep thinking about them and ask them in our post discussion.
And we can keep having this discussion.
So just for everyone watching, this panel has been recorded and will be available for replay for 30 days. And then there is going to be a Zoom meeting made available right after this. If you want to continue the conversation, we'll be dropping the link in the Facebook group, and you should also be getting an email. And so if you want to join that, please do. And again, just thanks everyone for participating tonight.
Thank you, Julia.
Thanks for having us. Awesome. Always talking with you. Joel, thanks.